The Langoliers was Stephen King's unconventional take on time travel, and the two-part TV miniseries that adapted the story for the small screen did a surprisingly decent job with the source material. The miniseries is, of course, notorious for falling flat in the CGI department, and we'll get to that, but the discourse online regarding the time travel rules within King's story and subsequently within the TV show is almost as interesting as the story itself. Hi there, I'm your host, Mr. Toomey, and this is a great undertaking. If you're into Stephen King's sci-fi stories and a TV miniseries whose special effects were so bad that those less than 2 minutes of bad CGI have completely overshadowed the other 178 minutes of an otherwise decent series, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. This is the second video in the 4 Past Midnight series. In my last video, I discussed the first novella from 4 Past Midnight, The Langoliers, a story of accidental time travel in which King rightly asserts that the past does not allow itself to be altered or manipulated. And in this video, I will be discussing the 1995 TV miniseries adaptation, which is about as close to a strict retelling of an original story as one can get. But that is, of course, not what the TV miniseries is renowned for. While I was looking around online for time travel theories and the use of time travel in films, I came across a few public forums in which King's use of and in-universe rules pertaining to the Langoliers were being scrutinized and called into question. Some folks believe King's strategy is paradoxical and that there are some inconsistencies, so I thought we'd go back down the time travel rabbit hole today to see what we could make of King's story and whether or not the critics were onto something. First and foremost, we're going to discuss the production, cast, score, and the special effects that earned the Langoliers its bad name before getting into the more philosophical stuff. The Langoliers, 2-part TV miniseries. History and details. This 1995 2-part TV miniseries was written and directed by Tom Holland, who had also written and directed Child's Play, Fright Night, and had adapted King's 1984 Richard Bachman novel Thinner for the big screen as well. My only regret is that I already made a Tom Holland joke in my video for Thinner, and so now I can't make that joke again in this video. Actually, you know what? I'm doing it. I don't care. Tom Holland, who wrote and directed The Langoliers, is currently 26 years old, so he was only 2 when The Langoliers first aired on ABC. That Tom Holland, what a talented and accomplished young man. Anyway, filming took place in and around Bangor International Airport in 1994. Bangor, Maine is of course the hometown of Stephen King, and King would make a customary, obligatory cameo in the series. Filming took approximately 2 months, and the budget was estimated to be in the neighborhood of $3 to $5 million. The cast was comprised of a few recognizable but mostly lesser-known actors and actresses. Chief among them was David Morse, who would go on to act in 12 Monkeys, as well as 2 additional King adaptations, both The Green Mile and Hearts in Atlantis. In The Langoliers, Morse played the role of airline pilot and lead protagonist Captain Brian Angle. Morse is a solid actor who performs admirably in the role. In addition to Morse, there is Frankie Faison, whose name sounds a lot like that of an Italian mobster. Hey, I'm Frankie Faison, gabagool, mozzarella, prosciutto, etc. And Faison had already been in a few major motion pictures prior to The Langoliers, most notably The Silence of the Lambs in 1991, and he would go on to act in the other 2 films in the Silence of the Lambs trilogy, Hannibal and Red Dragon. He was also featured in the hit HBO cop drama The Wire. 3-time Emmy Award-winning actress Patricia Wettig does well in the role of Laurel Stevenson. She is a motherly figure to Dinah, the young blind girl who was portrayed by Kate Maberly. Maberly isn't always knocking it out of the park, but she isn't among the worst child actors I've ever seen, so I consider that a win. My favorite character of the show was Nick Hopewell, as played by Mark Lindsay Chapman. Nick is a calm, collected assassin who has what I consider to be the most developed character storyline and background. He is compassionate and likable despite his shady past, and he's the glue that holds the team together. His redemption arc is really what makes him the standout among the other characters. Chapman gives off Pierce Brosnan, James Bond vibes, which I enjoyed. What can I say? I'm a sucker for a handsome gentleman with an accent. The most outrageous, over-the-top performance in the miniseries would come from Bronson Pinchot, who is cast as the delusional psychopath with the most severe of daddy issues, Craig Toomey. Pinchot is obnoxious, unhinged, and is maybe overdoing it just a bit, but he's a standout for better or worse. Some may remember Pinchot from the sitcom Perfect Strangers, in which he played fish-out-of-water character Balki Bartokamos, which could not be further removed from the character he plays in the Langoliers. Honestly, the Dance of Joy from Perfect Strangers still finds its way into my mind with regularity all these years later.
Now we are so happy we do the Dance of Joy! Hey! Die, 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 hey, 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 hey!
There were a bunch of other actors and actresses I don't want to take the time to cover. They were all decent at worst. I thought the majority of the acting was passable and no one was entirely awful, though there were some less convincing moments. But the acting was, as anyone who has seen the Langoliers knows, hardly the show's biggest detriment. That honor would, of course, be attributed to the Langoliers themselves and their not only dated but bad for the time special effects execution. If there's one thing this series is notorious for, it's the bad special effects, and that's a shame, honestly. The poorly rendered flying razor-toothed testicles don't appear until the final quarter of the show and are only in the series briefly, but they make such a strong negative impression that when you think of the Langoliers miniseries, they are likely the first thing that comes to mind. I went through and tracked the exact amount of time the Langoliers were actually on screen, and it was a whopping total of 83 seconds, most of which occurs in 2-second or even 1-second glimpses of the time-chomping omnivorous nightmare raisins. So 1 minute and 23 seconds was all it took to destroy whatever credibility this series may have managed to establish, and it really is unfortunate. Everyone involved did their best and put in a lot of work only to have their efforts undermined by a special effects department whose budget likely didn't give them much to work with. Needless to say, the god-awful mid-90s low-budget CGI, despite its insanely short amount of screen time, literally less than 1% of the show's entire runtime, tainted and overshadowed anything the series had done well for the majority of viewers. As for any other shortcomings, there is the soundtrack and score. The majority of the score is done using synths that aren't offensively cheesy, but aren't exactly triumphant or really even noticeably present. There are some light piano passages interspersed here and there, but during the more intense moments, it's just noise, not music or anything resembling a score or a melody or a rhythm. It's just a droning, nothing static sound that doesn't really elevate or intensify the mood. It's just kind of there. So it's safe to say the score didn't do the show any favors either, not because it was atrocious, but because it doesn't sound like a lot of effort, time, or finances were spent on it. Critics of the era weren't all that impressed with the miniseries, though most were willing to admit it wasn't without its charms. Some weren't quite so generous, however. In particular, TV Guide gave it 1 out of 5 stars, calling it tedious and boring, criticizing its dull script, cardboard characters, ludicrous special effects, and its, quote, dish-watery cast, with the sole exception of Pinchot, who rolls his eyes like an alien thespian from the planet Ham, unquote. And that last part, despite being an incredibly unusual combination of words, isn't entirely inaccurate. To be clear, I predominantly enjoyed the series. I thought the cast and premise were strong enough to overcome its shortcomings. It didn't hurt that Holland's screenplay kept remarkably close to the novella, with a great deal of the dialogue being pulled straight from the source material. Were there things they could have done better? Yeah, the CGI world-devouring metaphysical meatballs, most obviously, the anti-score, and perhaps Pinchot could have dialed it back just a little. But otherwise, I didn't find it nearly as painful to watch as I had anticipated. When I started digging around online for details and info regarding the show's production and critical reception, I knew I'd find plenty of criticism for the poor computer graphics, and yeah, there was so much of that. But there was something else that I hadn't anticipated, and that was the amount of criticism for and attention to the time travel aspects of the miniseries. A lot of folks were questioning just what the rules were and pointing out what they believed to be flaws and plot holes, and so I thought it would be fun to pick apart and explore these points, as I had honestly not spent a lot of time being critical of that particular aspect of the miniseries or of King's story. But before we move on, won't you please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel? And join me on my ongoing, seemingly endless exploration of everything Stephen King, which often leads down some unusual roads. Thanks in advance. Making Up for Lost Time. I just kind of arbitrarily chose that segment title. I was I wanted it to have something to do with time and have it be clever, but I couldn't come up with anything better than that. Sorry. Time travel rules are, well, they're entirely made up. From one piece of fiction to the next, there is no set of guidelines that one is required to follow in order to retain an accurate or fact-based perspective of just how such a thing would have to work. More often than not, whatever is changed in the past has a marked effect on the present and future, but not always. For instance, in the finale of Phase 3 of the MCU, altering the past ultimately created another alternate reality without affecting their own present or timeline. And plenty of other time travel takes, like the Terminator, Back to the Future, or 11/22/63, the whole idea is to manipulate the past in order to impact the events that follow, causing a new timeline and outcome. But as I discussed in my last video for the Langoliers novella, that was not King's approach. Rather, King posits that the past no longer exists and cannot be revisited outside a small window, and that the events of the past cannot be changed or revised. That isn't where the contention of critics stems from, though. It's more about how time travel works in the Langoliers, the act of moving backward or forward in time, as opposed to how the characters interact with the past or the consequent repercussions. So I'm going to go through some of these honestly reasonable questions from sites like Movie Mistakes, Quora, and Reddit, as well as the answers that other users on the sites provided. Because I really hadn't put all that much thought into the mechanics and rules King established until sorting through them, and some of these answers are kind of profound. So let's go through the questions and then read through the answers that were submitted to see whether or not they make sense, if I agree, and if I can offer an answer of my own. Okay, our first question asks, what happened to the people who disappeared? Did they die? And there are three very different answers to this question. The first answer reads, no, they didn't die. The premise of the story is that the sleeping plane passengers were in an alternate timeline a few minutes out of sync with normal time, so when they awoke, they were aware of a dead zone in the immediate past. Everyone else in the world is still alive in the present. The Langoliers were interdimensional creatures that fed on the past, gobbling it up like a stage cleaning crew. The second answer says, yes, the passengers who were awake through the time rift were killed instantly, including Nick Hopewell on the return trip. And the third answer reads, hey, you can't really assume anything with a film like this, and with a storyline being so mysterious and suspenseful, I think it is left up to one's imagination where the passengers disappeared to. Personally, I think or would like to believe they all survived, but in another dimension, probably in the fourth or fifth dimension, like with the Bermuda Triangle, which is very similar to the movie in relation to people disappearing without a trace. Alright, so totally reasonable question. 3 very different answers. The first answer seems to only be considering the people who disappeared that were not on the plane, though. They assume that everyone is in the present except those who were sleeping on the plane, while not taking into account the people who were on the plane that disappeared, leaving behind their personal belongings as well as dental implants, pacemakers, wigs, etc. So while, yes, those who weren't awake on the plane no doubt have moved on with time as usual, this doesn't account for those who vanished from the plane. As for the second and third answers, I agree that we can't possibly know that those who were awake when passing through the time rip are now dead or that they cease to exist. But as the final commenter states, there is really no definitive answer that King provides. Maybe they were winked out of existence, but who knows? Maybe they're on Altair 4. Okay, next question. Why did the people's stuff, loose change, watches, purses, and a wig, etc., stay on the plane, but their clothes were all gone? They may explain it in the movie, but I was reading the novella and didn't notice an answer. If it had something to do with being worn, wouldn't the wig have left too? Alright, so this is a great question and something I had wondered about myself. The first reply to this question states, Stephen King is notorious for writing such elements as haphazard, random, slightly without strict order, and I do not know if he does this deliberately or that he focuses on the weird aspect, the pacemaker and fillings remain but other things don't. But to take the speculation farther, clothing is somewhat organic, where the other things, even the wigs, are largely not organic, though many wigs are made with real hair. I just think King prefers this touch of random. I do too. The comment goes on, but this was the most relevant part of the reply, and the second reply touches on the organic materials point as well, saying, pure speculation, but maybe anything synthetic or heavily processed stays. That might leave a vinyl purse or belt, polyester scarves, pills, candy, and the like, but take cotton clothes. Food would be a judgment call. Makes me want to watch it again to see. It is fun to speculate that those aboard the flight who weren't asleep when the plane passed through the time rip were thrust into some unknown alternate dimension only to find that they'd been stripped of their worldly possessions. Though it was probably not a good outcome for the dude with the pacemaker or anyone who might have been wearing dentures. But as far as their clothes going with them, it's highly unlikely that everyone was wearing 100% cotton garments. And what about their shoes? Most, if not all, definitely would have contained a number of inorganic materials, so why weren't their shoes left behind? Anyway, I think it's safe to say it was indeed arbitrary, and King was just inconsistent with this specific issue. Alright, so this is the last question I'm going to cover in this segment, and it's the most interesting one to me. The question being, is there a reason why, when they're in the past, they can't catch up with the present, but when they land a little into the future, the present can catch up with them? Are they not moving along on their own timeline? And if not, why are they not left in that moment and stand there to see the present come and go without taking them? This was a question I had asked myself as well, and at first it felt paradoxical or at the very least inexplicable, but when I read this very well thought out response, and but then I read this very well thought out response, and I found the analogy both satisfying and eloquent. The reply states, think of time as a gear with only one tooth, and think of them, the remaining passengers, as a gear with only one notch. In the past, the one tooth has forever passed their notch, and they'll never be carried along in the flow of time again. In the future, the tooth comes along, snags their notch, and they're back in the flow of time. Just Wow, that's kind of brilliant. It's the best explanation I've heard so far to explain this disparity. The way I had thought of it was that in the past, when they brought something onto the plane that they passed through the time rift in, that item would gradually rejoin the present. It would become present again. It took a little while, but the beer regained its bubbles, the matches would light again, even the jet fuel was able to burn again once it was in the airplane's fuel tanks for a little while. And so, like all of those examples, when the passengers returned to the present from the past, they too took time to regain their presence, to resume their potency, to become a part of the current of time again. And so when all the other people at the airport who are living in the present fade back into existence, it is because the travelers themselves have become reacclimated to the present. It just took them a little while to rejoin the stream or the current of time. But I really like the one-toothed gear analogy. It's way more poetic than the nonsensical tangent I just went on. So for me, the only unanswered questions are what happened to those who were awake on the plane when they passed through the time portal, and was there actually any rhyme or reason to the things they left behind on the plane? And you know what? It's time travel, it's fiction, there are no rules. And leaving things up to the imagination isn't necessarily a bad thing. As much as I'd like to know the answers to these questions, that wouldn't necessarily have made the story or the mini-series better or more enjoyable. I like to think that King was focused on the story of the remaining passengers and likely felt that explaining everything away would detract from the important parts as well as the mystery. It is kind of funny though, since King is often criticized for being overly descriptive, and in this instance, when he doesn't cram in every detail, he's criticized for that as well. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. Final thoughts. The Langoliers is likely not going to find itself among too many top 10 Stephen King adaptations lists. And I get it, I do, but I think it's safe to say the show would be much more fondly remembered were it not for that 83 seconds of damning CGI. Sure, that isn't the only valid criticism that can be levied against the miniseries, but I thought the positives outweighed the negatives, if you're willing to overlook the more obvious flaws. There's a link below for anyone who would like to watch the entire miniseries for free on YouTube. I didn't hate it, but it is 3 hours long, so it's understandable if maybe you don't care to spend the time on it. Okay, so as I was digging around online, I came across this reimagined edit of the Langoliers entitled The Timekeepers of Eternity. From what I could find about it, Greek filmmaker whose name I am about to butcher, Aristoteles Margikaos, took the original footage from the 3-hour TV miniseries, boiled it down to a 1-hour film, and as you can see from this trailer, utilized a wild technique, making use of a torn paper theme and recentering the narrative to focus on Craig Toomey as the main character. The description from the filmmaker's website describes the film as Stephen King television movie is compressed and transformed through hypnotic black and white collage animation that meticulously reconstructs and reshapes its supernatural drama to an eerie and profound effect. I haven't been able to track down the entire film, but should I manage to get my hands on it, I will definitely be doing another video for it. Megan Navarro of Bloody Disgusting called the film, quote, an ambitious, unexpected experiment in remixing art with multiple techniques and mediums. It's a singular vision and a complete story that mines new ideas from a nearly 3-decade-old made-for-TV miniseries, unquote. So if anyone knows where to find the Timekeepers of Eternity, please let me know in the comments. In my next video, I'll be digging into the second story from 4 Past Midnight, Secret Window, Secret Garden, which is a story about plagiarism, imposter syndrome, and that great unknown realm where all stories ultimately come from. Something that Stephen King has theorized about in the past. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like and consider subscribing to the channel. Thanks to all my subs and constant commenters for leaving your thoughts in the comment sections of all of my videos. I appreciate your time and your contributions to this channel. I'll see you in a couple of weeks. Okay, goodbye. Be sure to click like and subscribe to the channel for my continued analysis of all things Stephen King, pretty pleased with Blood and Guts on top. My name is Mr. Doyle, and this has been a great undertaking.